Je suis Marion Jones et vous écoutez City Breaks. You're listening, in fact, to City Breaks Marseille, Episode 9, which I'm calling In the Footsteps of Marcel Pagnol, probably really the author from this area. Born just up the road in Aubagne, lived in Marseille for a period, wrote in various forms about the area, so autobiography, novels, plays, and for all that he spent many years in Paris too, and achieved really quite a level of fame in his own lifetime. When he died, it was back down in Provence, on the outskirts of Marseille, in fact, that he chose to be buried. So he really is very connected with the city. And in this episode, I'm going to set out a few biographical details, mention a handful of places that you can visit all connected to him, and indulge too in a few little extracts from his works. So they would be from the 2 autobiographical novels that he wrote, which are still so popular. La Gloire de Mon Père, My Father's Glory, so a homage to his father, and the companion volume, Le Château de Ma Mère, translation, My Mother's Castle. I'll be mentioning 3 plays which he set around the harbour in Marseille, and a pair of novels which tell an epic story of jealousy and revenge, all set in a little Provencal village. So I'm hoping you'll find the episode interesting for its own sake to listen to, but also that, if you wish, it will leave you with ideas for places to visit and things to read, and indeed watch, because both the novels and the plays were turned into films. So then, Marcel Pagnol, born at the very end of the 19th century, 1895, in a little town called Aubagne, which is about less than 20 kilometres away from Marseille and easily reachable by train. His father was a school teacher, and when he was about 5 or 6, they moved into the outskirts of Marseille because Dad was posted to a school there. And then when he was 9 or 10, one of the key moments in his life, the family bought a little country house in the village of La Treille, which is practically a suburb of Marseille these days, to which they used to go most weekends and certainly all through all the school holidays. It was there that he fell in love with Provence, describing so many of the places very fondly in his 2 autobiographical novels, and making it the setting too for Jean de Florette and Manon des Sources, his 2 epic dramatic novels with a whole cast of Provençal country characters. Marcel Pagnol went to school in Marseille, where he was especially good at languages and literature. He went on to become an English teacher in schools in Aix and Marseille to start with, and then eventually in Paris, where it was that he began to write alongside. During the 1920s, his trio of plays set around the Marseille harbour was published. They all have character names as their title, Marius, Fanny and César. In the 1930s, all 3 were filmed and very well received. And I need to summarise a bit because he was very prolific, in fact. But among his post-war works that are still well known and enjoyed today are the 2 childhood memory books, Gloire and Château, and the 2 novels, Jean de Florette and Manon des Sources. And all 4 of those works were also turned into films. He died in Paris in 1974, but had made it very clear that it was down south in Marseille, in La Treille in fact, that he wished to be buried, in the little cemetery where his parents had been buried alongside other members of his family. And it's from those 2 books of childhood reminiscences that you can get really a clearer picture of what his life was like and how strongly connected he was both to the area and to his family. Here, for example, is the opening of La Gloire de Mon Père. I was born in the town of Aubagne, beneath the goat-crowned Garlaban, in the days of the last goat herds. So the place is very specific, just near Garlaban, one of the best-known mountains, and so is the time, the turn of the last century, when there were still goat herds roaming the hills. And a little later in the book, at the beginning of chapter 3, in fact, comes a description of the town and the people who lived there. Quote, "This was a town of 10,000 inhabitants, perched on the hills of the Ouvone Valley, and through it passed the dusty road that led from Marseille to Toulon. Here people baked tiles, bricks and earthenware jugs, stuffed black puddings and chitterlings, tanned hides, which after 7 years in the bark pit never wore out. They also manufactured colourful santons, which are small clay figures for nativity crib scenes." And directly after that comes an introduction to the 2 people who was such an influence over the whole of his life, his parents. Quote, "My father, whose first name was Joseph, was a swarthy young man in those days, of less than medium height, though not exactly small. He had a biggish nose, but it was perfectly straight and advantageously shortened by his moustache and his spectacles, which had oval lenses set in narrow steel rims. His voice was deep and pleasant, and his blue-black hair fell into natural waves on rainy days. One day he met a little dark-haired seamstress called Augustine, and he found her so pretty he promptly married her. I never knew how they had met. It wasn't the sort of thing one talked about at home, nor did it ever occur to me to question them on the subject, for their youth and childhood were beyond my imaginings. My father's age was 25 years more than mine, and nothing could ever alter that. They were my father and mother from time immemorial and for evermore." In the first of the two books, La Gloire de Mon Père, My Father's Glory, we learn all about how Marcel adored his father, a rather bookish man, keen on facts, very much not keen on religion, a serious sort of man who, for example, didn't like to drink any alcohol. And little Marcel is aware from quite a young age what a contrast there is between his father and his Oncle Jules, the big jolly man that his auntie marries, who's very practical, good at hunting, has a strong Catholic faith, is not averse to a tipple or two, likes to enjoy a bottle of wine sometimes. And this all comes to a head in the key scene towards the end of the novel, where Marcel is aware that his father is being a little bit humiliated by his uncle. They go out hunting, Oncle Jules knows what he's doing, he's very good at it. But somehow or other, his father manages to shoot two rather rare birds, bartavelles as they're called in French, so rock partridges, and Marcel felt unbelievably proud of his dad for this. And the companion volume, Le Château de Ma Mère, My Mother's Castle, is an affectionate homage to his mother, who died when he was only 15, and it's really about the years when the family used to spend weekends and school holidays walking across the suburbs of Marseille, out into the countryside, to the little house where they could spend time surrounded by nature. The key scene revolves around the chateau of the title, because the family discover that you can take a shortcut on this really rather long walk where they're burdened by all the things they have to carry with them, by cutting across the land of the chateau. Father's not too keen, he thinks they shouldn't be doing it, but he's persuaded by an ex-pupil who's now a lock-keeper in the local area. And so they do start doing it until the dreadful day when the property owner confronts them and humiliates them by making them unpack all their luggage in front of him. And Marcel is haunted ever after by his father's shame, by the picture he remembers of his mother, who even then wasn't really very well, looking fatigued, not coping too well with the long walk, but wanting to do it for the sake of the family. Both books are also full of affectionate memories of the countryside, and the idea that it opened up to Marcel as he got a little bit older, and especially when he met a little friend, a local boy called Lily, who seemed to know everything about everything in the natural world and whom he really admired. Here's a paragraph from Chapter 5 of Le Château de Ma Mère, which is all about that. Quote, "Lily knew everything, what the weather would be like, where the hidden springs were, and the ravines where you could find mushrooms, wild lettuce, almond pine trees, sloe. He knew where, deep in some thicket, a few vine stocks remained, which had been spared by the phylloxera, and on which were ripening, in solitude, clusters of tart but delicious grapes. He could make a 3-hole flute from a reed. He would take a very dry branch of clematis, cut off a length between 2 knots, and thanks to the 1,000 invisible channels which ran with the grain of the wood, you could smoke it like a cigar." Reading Marcel Pagnol is quite likely to leave you with a desire to go and see the places he knew, and there are a number of possibilities. I'll put links in the show notes for ideas on audio-guided walks, so ones you can do yourself around the area, and also ones where a guide will show you round. An easy day trip or even half-day trip from Marseille is to take the train from the main station out to Aubagne. It'll take about a half an hour, I think, and there you are visiting the town where Pagnol was born and where he spent his first few years. The actual house where he was born, 16 Cours Barthélemy, is now both the tourist office and a museum. There's a plaque on the front which reads, In this house on the 28th of February 1895, Marcel Pagnol was born, member of l'Académie Française, died in Paris 18th of April 1974. And he does refer to the house in some of his writing. Here, for example, the first sight I recall is a very lofty fountain under the plane trees along the cour just in front of our house. There are other passages where he remembers looking out of the top window and seeing his father in the street below, playing boule. He was born up on the 3rd floor, but it's the ground floor today which has been made into a reconstruction of the flat, with lots of interesting memorabilia to look at, photographs, documents and so on. There are family photos, which you'll find fascinating if you've read the books, because you do really feel you know the people that he wrote about, and there are posters from some of his films and photos of him on set and all sorts. At the tourist office in the same building, you can collect a leaflet with a little idea for a town walk on it, and there are 2 places in particular that you might like to go and visit as well. One is the Petit Monde de Marcel Pagnol, so Marcel Pagnol's Little World, a collection of 200 or so of those little santons, the pottery figures that were originally nativity figures for Christmas, but here they've been used to reconstruct scenes from some of his books, scenes from his life, areas that he knew well and so on. And if you are bitten by the santon bug, there is also in Aubagne somewhere called the Village de Santons, so the village of santons, which is an indoor hall full of scenes recreated using santons, so Provencal hillsides, little villages, town squares, the inside of buildings, all full of little pottery figures in Provençal dress. All of that is very easy to find, not quite so straightforward. A couple of other ideas. Firstly, La Trée, which was originally a little village in its own right, the one where the family had the holiday house. It's at the foot of the Gare Laban. It's practically an outer suburb of Marseille these days, but I've seen it described as having la tranquillité d'un village de Provence, so the tranquillity of a Provençal village. And there you will find a little square with a fountain in it, which featured in one of the films. From the square you can do a walk of about 3 kilometres there and back to see the actual house, and you can visit the cemetery where Marcel Pagnol is buried alongside both his parents, his 2 brothers, sister, wife and little daughter. I found quite a good website on the idea of exploring La Trée for yourself, and I'll put the link to that in the show notes. And lastly, you could consider visiting the Château de la Busine, which is inextricably linked to him. It was the chateau which featured in the book, Le Château de la Mère, the scene he remembered so vividly of his parents' humiliation. It was also, in later life, a property which he himself owned. When he made his money in Paris, he returned to Provence and bought it. And these days it is a museum of cinema, somewhere where you can learn about film over the last 100 years and get to know a site which was very important to him. Going back to his writing, I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the works which are still read today, starting with the 3 plays, which were probably the first works that made his name. It's one continuous story really, but in 3 volumes. They all have the titles of the characters, Marius, Fanny and César, and they all revolve around a place which still exists in Marseille today, notably the Bar de la Marine, which is on the old port, about halfway down on the Notre-Dame de la Garde side. So you can visit it and have a drink to him, admire the photos on the wall, some of which show him, and others portraying scenes from the plays and the films. They're small-scale stories, sort of, with just very few characters, but very Marseille in flavour. So the main characters are the bar owner, César, and his son Marius, along with 2 ladies, the fishwife Honorine, and her daughter Fanny, who runs a shellfish stand just outside the bar. The first one, Marius, opens very much in Marseille flavour. The first line is, "Midday, the siren of the docks is sounding." And it's the story of the love which grows between Marius and Fanny, which is thwarted by the obsession which Marius has of setting off to sea. He looks out over the harbour and wonders where you'd get to if you set off in a boat, and really can't get this out of his mind. So it's very Marseille in flavour, because surely there must have been generations of young people doing and thinking exactly that. There's a scene towards the beginning of the play where Marius is talking to Escartefigue, who's the captain of the ship which does the harbour crossings. He says himself, "I've been doing that little trip 24 times every day for 30 years. And Marius is intrigued by this and says, "Well, don't you wonder about all those other people that you see?" "What other people?" replies Escartefigue. "Oh, you know, the ones who set off out through the port." Escartefigue doesn't understand and thinks, "Why would I want to think about them?" And Marius says dreamily, "Oh, because they're setting off into the distance." "Yes," replies Escartefigue, "and sometimes they don't make it." Marius doesn't understand this. "Surely," he says, "when you meet people from Madagascar or Brazil or somewhere, don't you just long to—" "No," says Escartefigue. Marius explains to Fanny that he doesn't want to be stuck behind this counter all his life. He reminisces to her about times he's met sailors and talked to them about the far-off places they've come from. And then, when he watches them sail off into the sunset, he just feels this irresistible pull. And so, in the end, Fanny gives him her blessing, and off he sets. And the play ends with her fainting on the quayside when she realises that he has actually gone. The next two plays continue the story. So the middle play, Fanny, opens with the revelation that Fanny is pregnant. She hadn't known that before Marius left. She ends up accepting a marriage proposal from someone else. And at the end of the play, who should reappear but Marius? And the third play, César, named after the little boy to whom she gave birth, is set 20 years later when her husband dies, and the story of what happens next plays out. These tales were really very popular. The dramatic storyline, the family dramas, the very typical Marseille characters, and they were equally popular when filmed. The two novels which have really stood the test of time and are read by generation after generation are Jean de Florette and Manon des Sources, an equally dramatic story, but set this time in rural Provence, centering around an elderly man, also called César, and his only remaining relative, Hugolin, his nephew, and the dreams they have for starting a flower business in this rather dry, dusty area and making their fortune. They are thwarted when a new neighbour arrives, Jean, who's come from the city, wants to live a rural life here because on the land which Jean has bought sits a spring, the only reliable source of water for miles around, on which César and Hugolin were hoping to rely to get their business going. So they block up the spring. Jean won't know that the water exists. And they spend a long hot summer watching him trying his best to fetch water from long distances away and keep his crops alive. His desperate efforts affect his health, and as a reader you sit there watching these two, watching him, thinking, are they going to give in, relent? And of course, they never do. And by the end of the first book, poor Jean has died, leaving behind his distraught wife and his little daughter, Manon. And the second book, Manon des Sources, which means Manon of the Springs, continues the story from about 10 years later, by which point Manon has discovered what happened to her father and starts to plot her revenge. Meanwhile, Hugolin, whose flowers are thriving, falls in love with her, and there are various dramatic twists at the end of the story, at least one of which I guarantee you definitely won't see coming. So, a cracking good read. Or watch, of course, if you choose the film instead of the book. It is said that Pagnol based the story on a Provencal legend about a mysterious shepherdess who was out to exact vengeance on her neighbours. Like his autobiographical works, it's very much full of a sense of place. These stories couldn't come from anywhere but Provence. So that's one reason why the books have been so popular, I think. But the other is definitely the dramatic story, which I saw in one review described as follows. Rich with twists and ramifications, Jean de Florette and Manon of the Springs sets an idealistic city man against two secretive and deceitful Provençal countrymen in a superbly realised story of a struggle for life, of crime and punishment, of betrayal and revenge, and of judgment and forgiveness. Another review I found describes it as, quote, biblical in its cadences, epic in its sweep to destiny, and old-fashioned in development of character and plot. This saga charts the destruction of a Provençal family. The novels were written in the 1960s, the films were made in the late 1980s, but I do think you'll find their appeal is timeless. I think that's the thing about Pagnol, really. He was certainly one of the best-known authors and filmmakers of the 20th century, but there's nothing highfalutin about him. His stories are gripping, and great themes that we can all relate to run through them. Perhaps that's why André Malraux, who was no mean author himself and also Minister of Culture in later life, described Pagnol as one of the great writers of our generation. And no less a filmmaker than Jean Renoir described him as the leading film artist of his age. If you enjoy books and films about places that you've visited or are thinking of visiting, I'm sure you'll love Pagnol. But actually, I think there's more to it than that, because the quality of his writing just springs off the page. He can be heartrending for sure. For example, in the last page or two of Le Château de Ma Mère, where he writes, "Time passes and turns the wheel of life as water turns the mill wheels," and goes on to describe the tragedy of what happened to the people he loved most. His mother died when he was only 15, about which he writes, "5 years later I was walking behind a black carriage whose wheels were so high that I could see the horse's hooves. I was dressed in black, and young Paul's hand," that's his brother, "was gripping mine with all its strength. My mother was being borne away forever." He writes of his brother who grew very tall, went on to be a goat herd, and died when he was only 30. About Paul he writes, "Along the hills of l'Étoile, which he couldn't bear to leave, he drove his herd of goats, and every night he would go to sleep on the pebbly ground of the garrigue, rolled in his woolen cloak with the he-goat's rope tied to his foot. He would rise when day rose, and the weight of sleep would leave on his cheek the imprint of some juniper seeds or the pattern of a spike of lavender. He was the last of Virgil's goat-herds." And his childhood friend Lily, the little boy who'd shown him all that he knew about life in the country, and who could name every plant and knew so many stories about the animals and birds that lived there, was killed in World War I. And it is with this that Le Château de Ma Mère ends. Quote, "During the war of 1914, in a black northern forest, a bullet in the forehead cut short his young life, and he had sunk, under the falling rain, on a tangle of chilly plants whose names he did not even know. Such is the life of man, a few joys quickly obliterated by unforgettable sorrows. But there is no need to tell the children so." I think the best way to end this episode is with a last description written by Pagnol on how he felt as a young boy when they left the village where they lived and walked up into the hills for one of those weekends or weeks in the country house. Quote, "We left the village, and then enchantment began. I felt welling up in me a love that was to last all my life. A vast landscape rose before us in a semicircle, reaching to the sky. Black pine woods, divided by valleys, died away like waves up to the foot of 3 rocky peaks. Around us the brows of lesser hills surrounded our path, which meandered along a crest between 2 valleys. A great, black, motionless bird marked the middle of the sky, and from all sides there rose, like a sea of music, the coppery hum of cicadas." Personally, I find I can't read Pagnol without thinking of Provence, and I can't go to Provence without thinking of Pagnol. So that ends the penultimate episode in the Marseille series, and for the very last one I'm going to do a sort of anthology, draw together some bits and pieces by different writers, some who've waxed eloquent about Provence or Marseille, others who've set novels there, and hopefully leave you with a few ideas for further reading should you wish to pursue them. For the meanwhile though, thank you very much for listening today, and I do hope that you'll be joining me next time to finish off the Marseille series, and indeed perhaps accompany me on into the future when further city breaks are planned. I've got 2 more series in the pipeline currently, both absolutely gorgeous cities with wonderful history and culture that I can't wait to share with you. Anyway, more of that anon. For the moment, let me sign off in French, as is only fitting. Merci bien et au revoir.